Hello and welcome to this week's session in our series of conversations with women in STEM leadership who are succeeding in this field against the barriers and biases and systemic issues that we see that are creating barriers for younger women to be choosing, firstly, education in the science and technology degrees, and then choosing to stay in these professions for long enough to make it to the senior leadership levels, board levels, and government, which is where we're seeing still in 2020 a great disparity of men and women and different biases and barriers that are in the way. So today we have the pleasure of talking with Professor Julie Cairney. Welcome, Julie.
Pleasure to be here.
You're currently a Professor of Engineering at the University of Sydney and the CEO of Microscopy Australia, and your PhD was in metallurgical engineering. So I'm keen to hear a little bit about your career story, how you came to be doing what you're doing, and the sorts of challenges you've had and ways you've overcome them to forge a career in STEM in leadership. So perhaps if we start with what you do now and what problem that solves.
What I do now. Okay, so I am a Professor of Engineering, as you mentioned. I work in the School of Aerospace, Mechanical and Mechatronic Engineering and do what we call a teaching and research job, which means in theory I would teach undergraduate students about engineering and undertake research related to engineering. But I'm not a conventional professor, so through my career I have had this type of academic role with an active research group as well as doing undergraduate teaching. But I tend to be quite successful with my research, and I've been asked to take on certain leadership responsibilities in that role. And so that's meant that it's kind of bought out the time that I would be spending on the teaching. And so although my role is a teaching and research role for the last 3 or 4 years, I haven't taught any undergraduate classes. Instead, the time that I would be spending teaching is being spent on the leadership responsibilities.
And could you articulate what those responsibilities are?
Absolutely. So I'm as you mentioned, the CEO of an organisation called Microscopy Australia. So firstly, let's just take it back a little bit. My area of expertise as a professor is understanding how the atomic scale structure of materials, and specifically alloys and the things that kind of engineering materials, how we can actually manipulate the properties of those things by understanding how the atoms are arranged. So in order to do that, and then I lead various industry related projects on how to develop new alloys, for example, to put wear resistant parts into the mining industry. So what do they make those out of? Well, we help the companies that make those types of products to be able to do that better by understanding what happens right down at the tiny level of the atoms. I'm a scientist, I'm providing that scientific input, but it has in the end an industry goal.
And it sounds like the industry is very much key in collaborating with you from the word go to ascertain what problem are we solving. And so it's not like you're beavering away with a research that might be totally fascinating to your group and yet doesn't have that practical application. And this is where engineering really leads the way in that industry and research collaboration. It's the so what of the research.
Absolutely. And I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to find wonderful industry partners who do appreciate that what seems like an almost esoteric thing to study can actually provide them with information that's useful for them to develop new products. So actually today I've been working on a proposal with a partner who are producing a new way of 3D printing big components for the mining industry, and they want to work with us because they know that we have expertise in understanding how they can develop good alloys that can go into their 3D printing process that can then be used in Australia's mines. Anyway, coming back to why I was telling you that, your question was, what do I do in my leadership roles? And now, because I'm an expert in understanding how atoms are arranged, I'm an expert in microscopy, so studying things at the highest length scales. And that means that over the years, I've become responsible for some quite substantial research labs that have very fancy, expensive electron microscopes. And so at the university, we have this place called the Australian Centre for Microscopy and Microanalysis, and we have many, many millions of dollars worth of microscopes that require special environments and take up a room. And they're a central facility that researchers from all over the country can come to use. And Microscopy Australia is this network of these types of central microscope labs that people can come to do research. And I help to provide oversight and strategy to that organisation about which types of microscopes do we need, what do COVID-19 researchers need to have access to at the moment, and where are those labs located, how can the people who need it get to it, how can the people who are developing the vaccines have access to the right types of labs to do what they do. So we have a very, very organised structure in Australia where these very, very expensive multi-million-dollar research platforms need to be available to anyone who needs to come and use them. It's not that University of Sydney buys a microscope just for people who are doing research at University of Sydney. It's open access user infrastructure. And so I provide the guidance about how we manage and organise the access to these expensive instruments.
So it's a very much an operational management role as well.
Absolutely, that's right. Of course, as the CEO, I'm providing strategic oversight for the organisation, and there is a chief operating officer, does most of the operational stuff. So in a lot of organisations, the chief operating officer is the one that most of the people report into, and the CEO is a bit more, there's more of a strategic role for a CEO. So that's really different. That's quite different to a conventional professor role. And so I do the research part of the job. I was just telling you about some of the industry research I do. And I have this research group of 10 people with some PhD students and a couple of junior researchers who work on those projects with me. But then I also have this other national leadership role that takes up the rest of my time.
I guess there's two questions. One I have is, what inspired you into this line of inquiry, into engineering per se? And then that next level of development from being the lead scientist and very successful researcher into a leader role, which has a vast array of skills and responsibility, is like another PhD in itself. Let's start with what inspired you, into engineering and into material science.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I come from a town called Broken Hill in the west of New South Wales, and I guess at school, I was a bit of an all-rounder. I wouldn't necessarily had imagined that I was going to go to university and study engineering. I loved music and I thought I wanted to be a lawyer at one point, but I was generally reasonably good, not exceptional at school. And I suppose as I got towards the final stages of my schooling, I was doing well in science and I was encouraged to take the physics subjects and the maths subjects because I was doing reasonably well at them. And I guess I thought I might study science, but I really liked the idea that what I was going to do was going to have an application. I'm not just interested in science for science sake, and I'm still not that interested in why atoms sit this direction and that direction, even though I do fundamental science. It's always for me about what can we do with that and how can we actually change the world or do something that will have an impact. And so to me, engineering, the whole definition of engineering was basically using science to achieve something. And so I just sort of fell into engineering. I was driven a little by the fact that there was a scholarship available in the mining town that I was from to study a mining related course, but I didn't see myself as wearing a hard hat and being a mining engineer, though that's a fantastic profession. And so I sort of found this kind of metallurgy, and I liked the sound of the subject. In the public school that I went to, we didn't have a lot of carefully considered career advice, so I just had a look in the UAC guide and chose the one that kind of appealed to me the most because I thought the subject sounded fun. I mean, that's truly the way that I fell into it.
Were there any challenges, like with it being a male-dominated environment? It doesn't sound like, even if it was, that didn't put you off. You were genuinely curious and focused on what was meaningful to you, and that was the perspective you were coming from.
Yeah, look, I've never felt that would be, you know, that if anything, it slightly appealed to me to go into a degree program where I was going to be a little bit different and forging some new territory or something like that. And I've been fortunate enough that it's kind of worked out that way. People do. Let's talk a little then about the gender thing, since
Yeah.
you're going there. There were, there were a few girls in my course, and there's always, and even now, I think I'm the only female faculty in my school now. We had another one that the school got restructured, and she moved to the biomedical school, and so we don't have any other female academic staff at all. And I think there's maybe 35 academic staff in my school, but I don't feel as if I work in an environment where it's hard to be a female. I mean, engineers are very kind of respectful, slightly nerdy type people who they're not the type of people who, in my world, and I'm not trying to say that it's like this everywhere, but in my world, people are, you know, they almost listen to you more because you sound different and you act a little bit differently. And I've always felt that it's been actually okay to be the one who's a little bit different in the room, compared to, say, I have colleagues who go into medicine where they tell me they go to staff meetings, and of course all the really senior people are male, and they're all sort of these alpha type, beating their chest type people, whereas in engineering people are lovely, deferential, respectful, like, you know, it's just not the same kind of difficult environment. So I think that engineering is a really fantastic profession for women. It's very creative, very impactful. You're doing things that can make a difference in the world. And generally, engineers, although mostly male, are lovely people.
Yeah, my father was an engineer. I'd second that.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is what makes this so fascinating. It really does depend on your personal experience as to the impact of the studies of the gender, the great divide in pay gaps, in women not being able to have their voice heard at the table, to get a seat at the table. Different environments have their own unique cultures, and the focus is largely on task here. What can science do to solve this problem? So when we're all focused on task with the same intent in mind, I wonder if that helps then not be so conscious of our own position in that. I mean, that's what I hear with women like yourself, Julie, who are in these senior roles and leading and managing and mentoring and being the leading light without even thinking about being the leader or being a leading light. You're simply doing what the job requires, but it marries up with what's important to you. This is what I'm seeing as an alignment of values without you necessarily articulating that every morning that you wake up, as opposed to a lot of the work that I do as a leader development coach and executive coach in corporates and in career transition, executive transition. It's about helping people realign what's important to them and their values to make that next move, because to become something different requires identity shifts within us. So I'm curious to hear, who were your role models then? You grew up in Broken Hill in the West, where real work is done on the land and with the land. And this is also very much really what you work in with the engineering, and how do we make things better through work at the atomic level. So who were your role models?
Okay, tricky question. Yeah, look, I've been fortunate enough to work with fantastic bosses. So as I finished my degree and went on to do my PhD, I had a really wonderfully supportive PhD supervisor, male PhD supervisor, and it was somebody that I very much respected and admired and aspired to be like. Then I was abroad for a few years, and I came back again, and I was working as a junior researcher under another male academic at the University of New South Wales, who also was a very good and supportive boss. And both of those people have gone on to senior leadership roles. So one of them went on to become the Dean of Engineering at the University of New South Wales, which is you're responsible for a $5.5 billion budget in that role. It's a really serious leadership role, and another is an associate dean there, and was a head of school. And so I guess the people that I worked with moved into these leadership roles. And so seeing these people that I admired and saw as role models following those paths have made me feel as if it was something that I could do as well. And that I saw that as an option for me. In terms of female role models, that was less important to me when I was younger. But after I had children, I think life changes a little bit when you have children. You just have so much more responsibility, and gender starts to make more of a difference to how much of that responsibility falls onto your shoulders. And you are balancing things in a way that some of my peers are also balancing those same challenges, but just not in the same way, with the same feelings and the same kind of situation. And I think at that point, it became more important to me to be connected with and to have the opportunity to talk to more senior women. And for me, especially ones that had been through, like, had children themselves, because I mean, I have very few female peers, and I have even less who have children. And so at that point, I did actually seek out mentorship. So I approached a fabulous lady named Kathy Foley, who's the chief scientist of CSIRO.
Yep.
And she wasn't in that role at the time, but she was already in a very senior leadership role within CSIRO. And she was very kind in having regular meetings with me. And that was the first time that I'd had, I think, a successful kind of mentoring arrangement. I'd been in the past in sort of formal mentoring schemes where you're just matched up with somebody random and you go there and you have a coffee and you don't quite connect. But this was somebody that I had chosen as a person that I really respected and admired, and who was kind enough to make the time for me. And I found that very, very beneficial, because I was able to bounce ideas. And you do reach a point where you get into a senior leadership role, and you're at the sort of top. You of course have a reporting line, but you're at the top of your business unit, and you no longer have somebody that you can just bounce things off anymore. You're the one who's expected to make the decisions, and it's suddenly very isolating. So that was really very helpful for me to have the opportunity to talk to somebody like that. And I would recommend that to anybody. And what I would recommend is ask for that opportunity. Actually find the person that you want to learn from and approach them, rather than just try to talk to anyone. It doesn't always work. Yeah.
And this is another trait I see too, Julie, is to have the courage to ask, because that tells me you had enough self-esteem to feel worthy enough to ask someone who's in a higher position than you and is busier than you, and to actually have that conversation. So
it took
that's
me 6 months to get the guts to ask, though. So I had the idea of doing it, and I sat on it for a year, and I knew the person that I wanted to talk to. And then I actually met that person in person, and so I said, look, I've been thinking of asking you to do something for me for a long time. And she was kind enough to say yes. And I think a lot of people are very senior people find it very rewarding to give back and bring people up. And people might be surprised how willing people are to give their time.
Absolutely. And that's indeed how I came to be doing the coaching I do now, was actually taking a mentoring role in the last corporation I worked with. And I loved that so much, to be able to be that person, to hold space, and to realize I had experience that could potentially make the difference of how quickly someone moved up to their next role or not. And you're right, it is very reciprocal that way. And also they will tell you if they're not available, or if they don't feel they're the right person for you as well, because it takes their investment of time back again. This is where we encourage girls to speak up and ask, and to know that they are valuable enough to ask for someone's time. And for some, that can be a personality trait if they happen to be a more dominant type of personality. But this is where it's not just about personality. These are traits and these are skills that can be learned if we can educate and give them that experience early enough. And this is what I see too in a lot of talent programs. Yes, we're looking for that top 10%, and we invest in those because we see they will have and want to have the biggest impact in the world as well. But I think there's a whole band of what should be more democratic leadership development, that everybody should have that chance of being able to experience possibility and their value, because it certainly seems like you'll take something by the horns and you've got the skills, you've got the toolkit there. So very much that self-motivated, you realize where there's a gap and then who can help you to bridge that gap. And that's an important leadership skill, because as leaders, sometimes you can assume that you are supposed to have all the answers, and that's not what good leadership is either. So in terms of what you know now and what you've learned through your leadership development work and working as a business leader and that top researcher, what challenges do you have now?
My constant challenge of the last 10 years of my life is time management. Again, that comes with balancing a family and a very serious job, and wanting to not do either of those things half-heartedly. So being really ruthless with the diary and the time, and seeing time as a valuable resource, and always trying to carve out time for the things that are actually important rather than the things that are urgent. And that's my biggest challenge. Earlier, you mentioned the transition to leadership, and you asked a question about moving from the standard role into a leadership role. And then you were talking about how you need to seek out the skills and the support that you need. So that was and that's only for me, like 3 or 4 years ago, that I moved from having various associate dean or deputy director type responsibilities that gave me opportunities for training and seeing, but then actually being in an actual leadership role with a structure of people coming into that role and being perceived as a leader. And that was a whole new learning curve for me. So life just felt really different. It went from kind of feeling like I was one of a group of people where I was comfortable, to suddenly people are speaking to you in a different way because they know that what you say might have an impact on them. It's a little bit isolating, and we have, as a scientist and an engineer, no training for that type of activity. And then suddenly I was a CEO reporting into a board. I didn't even know what a board did and what a CEO was supposed to do and what was the role of this board anyway. And so that year I did a lot of leadership training. I joined a Chief Executive Women program, which took quite a lot of my time, and I went off and I did the company directors course so that I would understand how CEOs should interact with boards, which is really a lot of study required to do that course as well. But in the course of 18 months, I got the confidence to know that the way that I was approaching my role was not necessarily how you have to be when you're in a leadership role, but it was one of the acceptable, viable ways of doing it, having a kind of authentic response, and not necessarily, I'm not an authoritarian type leader, is a valid leadership style. Had the opportunity to actually learn how to do this rather than just think that that's something that you should just be able to do. And so I think it's really important to recognize that if you're doing something new, you have to actually go out and look for information about it, how to do that, and things don't necessarily have to come naturally.
Yeah, you're so right, Julie. And don't we see that with our teachers today? How do they know about what the future of work requires to be those first port of calls in primary school, in high school, to be guiding our students about what's possible for them? They don't have that current education about the massive explosion of information-driven decision making, all of that. They're still schooled how they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There is such expectation that we're just going to know. They don't just know. And that's why it's so important to recognize what those gaps are and then go to the right places for help. Like you say, you realize that there was a skills gap in how to be a CEO, how to be effective working with a board. The company directors course gave you that new set of information and education around that, and giving yourself permission to learn, but also having your environment give you that permission and space to learn, because that's another key challenge, whether it be with academia or teaching. There is so much overhead admin. How do they do their research and then deliver on giving lectures and being that inspirer for the students coming through? So I think The whole academic sector is in a state of transformation as well. And we talk about what is the value of STEM education and training, and why are these skills so needed in leadership, in decision making. And what I'm seeing as I have conversations with people like yourself, it is your very deliberate approach and considered approach to how you solve problems. The value in that is we're only scratching the surface from a commercial aspect of we need more women in those commercial decision making conversations and roles. Much like yourself, I was flicking through the university admissions book. Which way do I want to go? Oh, you're bright, you can do whatever you want to do. And it was life at the molecular level that really got me. So I studied biochemistry. And now I find that I'm marrying that up with how do we make sure that as individuals that we're harnessing our potential and then expressing that in the world and enabling more people to do that. So in terms of your advice, if there was one thing that you knew now that you wish you had have known, say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, if you were speaking to your younger self or you were speaking to someone coming out of their PhD, what would you want them to know that you think could really facilitate their growth?
Okay, so there's two things. One is don't be afraid to articulate what you want to do, what you want to achieve, and where you want to be. That doesn't necessarily mean you'd be expecting that you can get there faster than is practical. Everybody has to realize that if you aspire to be a CEO, there's probably 20 years of hard work involved with getting there. But I don't think there's anything wrong with somebody who's just starting out saying that they aspire to be, maybe not being, a wanker about it, but aspire to be in a leadership role. And I learned that from one of my mentors. So one of my supervisors that I was speaking about, the one who became the Dean of Engineering at University of New South Wales, he always said that he wanted to be in a really senior leadership role, and nobody ever laughed at him or thought he was silly. They just saw, and then when opportunities came up, people thought of Mark because they knew that that was what he actually wanted to do. And so I learned from that. Again, without actually expecting things, telling people that you have aspirations of being in a very senior role isn't a bad thing. Don't harbor it inside, because otherwise people think you might not actually be interested in doing it. And then the second thing I was going to say is, you were saying it's hard to make time for things that matter, but you have to make it happen yourself. And bosses want you to manage up. So in any kind of working environment, especially for your students who may never have had an opportunity of working before, what your bosses want is for you to independently manage and deliver on the things that you've been asked to do. And also they want to make sure that you get opportunities for professional development, and they want to see you succeed. But it's just hard for them to know exactly what you need and provide you with that support. So if what you can do is work with the person, your boss, and come in and say, here's the stuff that I'm planning to do to make sure I can get my deliverables done. And I'm also wanting to carve out time for this type of professional development. What would you suggest? What would you advise? Here's something I thought of. And try to make it easy for the people you work with. It's basically managing up, not necessarily just being responsive and waiting and feeling like doing what you're told is going to mean that you're doing the right thing. Because it's actually what the people that you work for want you to do.
Yeah, I'm hearing come with the solution focus, come with suggestions, come with being clear about what you want, or being clear about wanting to talk about what you want. Yeah, because
and balancing what they need you to achieve with what you want. Yeah.
Yes, so what's in it for them, but also to really be putting yourself in the picture. And I don't know whether you see this, Julie, but I see particularly the women in the middle management roles often lose sight of that, and they're so busy delivering upwards, but also pleasing downwards, that they themselves lose sight of what about me and what I need, either for my next move or for my development. And they'll come into training programs and they're there because they want to see what they can be taking back for their team. I said, no, this is for you. This is for you to have time for you. What do you need? And often it's blank. because they haven't given themselves that same honor that they give to the value they put on delivering really well upwards and making sure that their team has everything they need. What I see in women managers too is that they are often much better at sensing and looking after what their team might need.
And I think also a lot of our female managers are definitely, this is me too, very focused on trying to see things from the perspective of their employees and helping them to achieve what it is that they need. And sometimes I think the problem is that because they do it, they kind of expect it of the person that they work for as well. So they're waiting for someone else to give them the kind of support that they're giving their team. And just not everybody does that. Not every manager does it. And you may not work for one of those managers who does that for you. And so you have to make sure you do that and you do it for your team, for yourself and for your team. Yeah. Or help the person you work for do it for you.
Yes, because then that's role modeling as well, is when your team sees you expressing your needs and making sure they get met. That's one way that we can at least minimize burnout doing leadership, managing yourself through that, which clearly you're very good at doing that as well, Julie, and to be able to be doing everything that you're doing. But as we finish off now, what would you say would be your top 3 strengths, your go-to strengths that get you through those times when it's not so easy?
Yeah, okay. I'm adaptable and resilient. I'm often talking about reframing. Something's just gone wrong, and rather than dwelling on the thing that went wrong, what did we do wrong to get to that point? What did I do wrong to get to that point? Here we are. This is where we stand now. And what's the best path from here? That's reframing, like set the picture again. And so resilience and just being a little bit easygoing. Sometimes, yes, and that's very easy to say and not as easy to do. But I try to make myself be easygoing sometimes. So
not take things so seriously, or not make it all about you. And is it Brené Brown talks about, I made a mistake, I'm not a mistake. That's something I come back to when people are really taking it. They're taking way too much of the blame for why something perhaps didn't go as well as they'd hoped to. We're our own biggest enemy, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, that's been wonderful. Thank you.